almost all of mankind is politically awake, activated, politically conscious, and interactive. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people.
Do we have plans to invade the Middle East?
Are you crazy?
Am I?
Look, Turner.
Do we have plans?
No, absolutely not. We have games. That's all. We play games. What if? How many men? What would it take? Is there a cheaper way to destabilize a regime? That's what we're paid to do.
Boy, what is it with you people? You think not getting caught in a lie is the same thing as telling the truth?
No. It's simple economics. Today it's oil, right? In 10 or 15 years, food, plutonium, and maybe even sooner. Now, what do you think the people are going to want us to do then?
Ask them.
Not now. Then. Ask them when they're running out. Ask them when there's no heat in their homes and they're cold. Ask them when their engines stop. Ask them when people who've never known hunger start going hungry. You want to know something? They won't want us to ask them. They'll just want us to get it for them.
And you play fucking games.
Right. And the other side does too. That's why we can't let you stay outside.
Well, go on home, Higgins. Go on. They've got it. What? You know where we are. Just look around. They've got it. That's where they ship from. They got all of it.
What? What did you do?
I told him a story. You play games. I told him a story.
Oh, you poor dumb son of a bitch. You've done more damage than you know.
I hope so.
You're about to be a very lonely man. It didn't have to end this way.
Of course it did.
Hey, Turner. How do you know they'll print it? You can take a walk, but how far if they don't print it?
They'll print it.
How do you know?
Asked whether I believe we are safer, more secure, that Iraq is better, but our own security is better. With Saddam and his two sons out of power and out of office than in office, I believe indeed that we are. I really think it's time we learnt, as a matter of sensible foreign policy, that the way to deal with one dictatorial threat is not to back another. That actually the best answer to what is happening in Iran is to allow the Iraqi people the freedom and democratic choice that we enjoy in countries like ours.
Let me ask you to go all the way back to the first Gulf War. I covered it, and I was stunned by one of the paragraphs that sort of leapt out at me that you quote. You basically quote Saddam Hussein saying, Saddam in essence said, look, if you guys did not want me to go into Kuwait, and he's talking about August of 1990, why didn't you tell me you'd deploy 500,000 troops, 6 carrier battle groups, 1,400 combat aircraft in a coalition of 32 countries? I'm not crazy. If you'd simply told me, I would have not gone into Kuwait. Did nobody tell him?
So nobody told him that. This is something that he said to his debriefers after we caught him in Iraq. One of the lessons of my 33 years, Christian, and I'm sure you know this too, is that there are a lot of misperceptions in international relations. There's a lot of miscommunication. And I think that that was one of the lessons here. If he had known how we were going to respond, he would not have done it.
A country can use force to protect itself if it's under threat of imminent attack or is attacked. But when it comes to the collective interest and the use of force for collective protection, only the Security Council can authorize that force. And that was one of the reasons, for example, on Iraq, my position was very clear. I did not support the war in Iraq because I think it was not in conformity with the Charter, and actually still feel the same way. And we have seen the results of some of these interventions and the impact it has had on the countries and in some situations on the whole region. And so I still maintain it is safer to go through the Council, work with the other member states to make our world a better place. And whenever we have ignored the Council and gone it alone, the results have not been very encouraging.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
And our resolve is clear. The people of Libya must be protected.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You'd think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli.
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in 96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro. A gold dinar would have had serious consequences for the world financial system, but may also have empowered the people of Africa, something black activists say the US wants to avoid at all costs.
The United States should welcome the self-determination of Africans. They certainly have denied self-determination to Africans inside the United States, so we're not surprised by anything that the United States would do to hinder self-determination of Africans on the continent.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
Moscow and Washington say they hope that the FBI arrests of alleged Russian agents will not affect relations between the two. For more insight on this, we're now joined by former MI5 officer Annie Machon from Dusseldorf. Hello to you. So, the FBI says the suspects have been under investigation since 2004. If so, why has it taken so long to charge them? What do you make of the timing here?
Well, I think it's very interesting, of course. I mean, there have been reports that they've said they've been aware of the ring and since 2000, in fact. So, yes, the fact that it comes hard on the heels of a very successful meeting between the US and the Russian presidents in Washington is interesting politically. But I would suggest also that we could sort of delve behind the scenes a little bit. First of all, the intelligence agencies in the US have been very much under attack over the last year or two for a whole number of reasons. Their involvement in things like extraordinary rendition, torture, surveillance of domestic political activists, things like that. So to go to an good old-fashioned Cold War spy story and regain a bit of credibility, I think it's probably something that they would aspire to. So this is very much sort of familiar territory. Everyone loves a good spy story, and I think this is pure propaganda. But I think there's also another aspect to that as well, and that's very much the insider view. Within the intelligence world, there are competing agencies. I think at the last count there are at least 17 agencies in the US. And they all vie for position and prestige and resources and staff numbers. So, of course, if the FBI can produce this wonderful result suddenly out of the blue, then their credit will skyrocket and they will go up the pecking order. So I think there's a whole range of layers behind this sudden arrest, the political only being one of them.
So a possible PR stunt here. Let's continue. Neither Moscow nor Washington want this to affect their relations. Now, in your experience, how possible is it for intelligence and politics to be separated in this way?
Very difficult indeed, because the intelligence agencies do like to meddle in politics. Sometimes you do get rogue elements within agencies who will go off and do their own thing. I don't think in this case that's what happened. I think it's more likely that perhaps more hardline factions within the American administration perhaps egged on the FBI to try and get them to come up with this result because of the need to keep a sort of strategy of tension between the USA and Russia. Of course, if you have a strategy of tension, then what you get is additional military air bases in the Central Asia area and things like that, which of course is very good for big business, particularly companies like Halliburton that tends to build and supply these sort of bases to the US government. And many people who used to be involved in the old administration, the neocon administration, of course are very closely linked to those sort of companies. So I think, one, it's a political advantage for the hardliners, and two, it's a great economic advantage, potentially, to a number of big US corporations.
Oh, you've given us some fascinating insight there into the workings of the back wings of Washington, but we've heard about the US Department of State trying to, the State Department distancing itself from the Justice Department's decision. What kind of an inside game does this indicate to you?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, something about the whole story doesn't ring quite true to me. I used to be a fan of the spy writer Graham Greene, who was a former intelligence officer. He wrote in the middle of the last century. He wrote a very good book called Our Man in Havana, where an MI6 officer in the novel builds up a fake spy ring in order to gain kudos and extra money from his political masters in the UK. So I'm wondering if there might be some element of something like this going on. I'm not too sure. But I think also it's very disingenuous. I mean, I think most people can see that it's a political hot potato within the different departments in the US. And it's very disingenuous that they're making such a big story out of this in the media. Because, of course, other spy rings have been caught in the US in the last decade. Most notably the so-called dancing Israelis who were arrested shortly after 9/11. They were seen celebrating the collapse of the Twin Towers. And also the alleged art student spy ring, which was rounded up in 2002. And they, again, were supposedly Israeli Mossad agents. Now, both of these spy rings weren't prosecuted, and in fact, the stories have been quietly removed from things like Fox News websites and things. And the spies, or alleged spies, were just quietly deported back to Israel. There was no political hoo-ha, there was no media hoo-ha, and there was no prosecutions. So I think whatever happens to these alleged spies, and let's bear in mind that they are innocent until proven guilty, whatever happens to them is done for political reasons.
All right, very interesting insight there indeed. Former MI5 officer Annie Machon from Dusseldorf. Thank you.
We cannot allow a safe haven to develop there that can be used to carry out attacks that can kill Americans, including here in our homeland.
So do you believe that the ISIS is a national security threat to the United States?
Well, do you know where the safe haven is?
The safe haven's in Syria. So those who, but let me finish. Because the thing is that they would not be empowered in Iraq if we were not providing safe haven in Syria by arming their allies.
So should we go to Syria? I mean, the thing is, we kind of are where we are.
No,
so
well, we are where we are because we are where we are because we armed the Syrian rebels. We have been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, fighting alongside ISIS. ISIS is now emboldened in 2 countries. But here's the anomaly. We're with ISIS in Syria. We're on the same side of the war. So those who want to get involved to stop ISIS in Iraq are allied with ISIS in Syria. That is the real contradiction to this whole policy.
Right. And many of your Republican colleagues would argue that what we should have done in Syria was get rid of Assad, and that would have stopped ISIS in his tracks. But
we've done this. Look at Libya. We went into Libya and we got rid of that terrible Gaddafi. Now it's a jihadist wonderland over there. There's jihadists everywhere. If we were to get rid of Assad, it would be a jihadist wonderland in Syria. It's now a jihadist wonderland in Iraq, precisely because we got over-involved, not because we had too little involvement, but too much involvement.
And here we are. Can a terrorist haven in Iraq, does a terrorist haven in Iraq, which it may be soon, threaten the national security of the U.S.? Yes or no?
Well, it could at some point. I would say right now, if you are a member of ISIS, you're looking at the Shiites right in front of you in the battles you're fighting. I don't believe that ISIS is right now in the middle of a battle saying, I think we're going to send intercontinental ballistic missiles to America. So could they be a threat? Yes. But what I would say
Shouldn't we stop them now?
Well, we should have not armed them. If we wouldn't have armed them in Syria, maybe they wouldn't be in Iraq.
Right?
Well, the past is 6 months ago. The past is still the current as well. It is the present. We are still arming the radical Islamic rebels in Syria. So the homeland, they're going back and forth across the border. They go back into Syria, and that is a homeland that we are helping to defend for them.
How do you stop that?
Well, let's not be involved in the Syrian civil war, and let's not be involved in the Iraq civil war. I think that
out altogether.
Well, no. What I would say is that Maliki is an ally. Although here's the thing: is they think they're going to create stability by pushing Maliki out in the middle of a war. So we push him out, and then we have another power vacuum, and nobody leading the country at all. What I would say is, and my prediction is, that Maliki will stand up, and the Shiites will stand up, that ISIS will not be able to take Baghdad, and there will be a civil war over there, but there'll be a civil war with feckless people on one side that aren't necessarily great allies of ours, who are allies of Iran, and on the other side, allies of Al-Qaeda. You have to ask yourself, are you willing to send your son? Am I willing to send my son to retake back a city, Mosul, that they weren't willing to defend themselves? I'm not willing to send my son into that mess.
Was moving too slowly, but the fall of Ramadi has galvanized the Iraqi government. So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from We're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
We all know that the United States prides itself in being the beacon of democracy and freedom. When it comes to Russia's latest steps surrounding the events unraveling in Ukraine, accusations have been flying high from Washington. But if we look at countless facts, past and present, while the U.S. demands that its finger-pointing is taken seriously by the rest of the world, how often has the U.S. listened to what others had to say on its actions? Russia has a naval base in Crimea that has been there for years. The U.S., in the meantime, has more than 700 military bases around the world and is the notorious world leader of getting involved in wars that are opposed to not just at home, but also abroad. But memory, when convenient, becomes short.
You just don't invade another country on phony pretext.
As if the invasion of Iraq in 2003 had never happened under what was later proven to be such false pretenses, some would argue the world is still shocked.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines.
The U.S. war in Afghanistan is officially the longest-running war in American history. And let's not forget the drone war killing civilians abroad that the U.S. is leading. No more drones! Despite sharp criticism of these tactics. And most recently, Syria, of course, yet another potential military escapade that the U.S. president had been rooting for that was essentially avoided at the last minute, largely thanks to Russia, that spearheaded brokering another way towards a solution.
I have decided that the United States should take military action against
Syrian regime targets.
Military aggression, one example after another. Russia has strategic reasons to care about what happens in Crimea next, as opposed to undertaking military ventures whenever fancy strikes. As has become so traditional in the US, it barely surprises anyone anymore. Actual military action has not even been given a green light for by the Russian president, and Russia never said it's interested in war with Ukraine. Regardless, the world's top aggressor accuses Moscow of being one, applying double standards upon convenience. Anastasia Churkina, RT, New York.
For almost a year following the forceful regime change in Ukraine, the following has been Barack Obama's main message.
People and nations have the right to determine their own destiny, and that includes the people of Ukraine. Courage of the Ukrainian people in standing up on behalf of democracy. Let the Ukrainians make their own decisions about their own lives.
An expression of people's free will, which in the end turned very ugly. And Russia's reaction to the events in Kiev was discussed by President Obama, this in his latest interview with CNN.
Since Mr. Putin made this decision around Crimea and Ukraine, not because of some grand strategy, but essentially because he was caught off balance by the protests in the Maidan and Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine. Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine. Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine.
So the Ukrainians' expression of free will didn't come without a nudge from Washington after all. In February last year, a deal was signed between the former Ukrainian president and the opposition to end the crisis peacefully. There were indeed foreign brokers present, but not from Washington. And despite the agreement, violence ensued. Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute believes Obama's admission sheds light on the murky truth of what happened.
Well, I think one thing that it says is the president can't get his story straight. There were probably a bunch of people having a heart attack in the State Department when he said that. But essentially it's true. What I wonder is if it's true on a different level than we even know, maybe the deal we brokered is something that the president and the U.S. State Department was doing behind the scenes while the EU was engaged in negotiating with Yanukovych and negotiating this sort of transition of power away from the president. As we know, that night was a very mysterious night. Everyone went to bed thinking that a deal was brokered to stave off the violence that followed, where we woke up in the morning and power had been seized by a group that was close to the U.S. So maybe he was telling more truth than he meant to tell in that statement.
Now, 1 year after the power change, Kiev remains stuck in a bloody conflict with those who are not happy with the new regime. Though the U.S. keeps on supporting Kiev with loans to prop up its war-torn economy and non-lethal equipment for its army. And it is considering sending lethal weapons. That's according to the chief of the U.S. military forces in Europe, while not showing up, though, at the recent round of peace talks, which, according to Daniel McAdams, is also indicative of Washington's goals in Ukraine.
We've been hearing this garbage for more than a decade. The U.S. claimed that the Orange Revolution was purely the action of Ukrainians who wanted a better life. And certainly there's an element of that in all color revolutions. There's an element of people who genuinely, A, want a better life and who doesn't, and B, who buy into the West propaganda that if you just do X, Y, or Z, you'll be living like the Swiss, rich and happy. That's always the case. But the reality is the U.S. has pumped in billions of dollars in Ukraine. We all know the quote from Newland that the U.S. has spent $5 billion promoting democracy in Ukraine. It's not even up for discussion. The U.S. financed the Orange Revolution, and Victoria Nuland and the State Department was heavily involved in this latest revolution in Ukraine.
American and Ukrainian officers met at the Yavoriv base near Ukraine's border with Poland to plan the training. Outside, American paratroopers waiting to start the training posed for photographers before getting to work. Many of their Ukrainian counterparts have seen intensive action in eastern Ukraine, but need to build their basic skills as they continue to face off against rebels backed by Russia. Standing with the U.S. ambassador, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said Britain, Canada, and Poland will also help with the training, which he said represents a new dimension in Ukraine's cooperation with its Western supporters.
I want to assure you that we are doing everything possible to widen our cooperation in the shortest possible period of time. We are doing everything possible on our side, and I am confident that the ambassador is also making active efforts to widen this cooperation.
The training comes as violations continue to mar a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, where international observers report daily fighting. In Moscow on Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov acknowledged that the rebels are responsible for some of the attacks, but blamed Ukraine for most of the violations, which the Ukrainian government denies. This training base is more than 1,200 kilometers from the front lines, but U.S. Army Major Michael Wiseman says it's much closer in the minds of these troops.
I think that our presence here in Ukraine, one, it's at the request of the Ukrainian government, but I think it sends a strong message to anyone that the U.S. supports the independence and integrity of Ukraine.
The symbolism of this training is not lost on anyone, but the troops say the individual and small unit skills will also have a practical effect on both the proficiency and morale of the Ukrainian troops. Al Pessin, VOA News, London.
Several videos have appeared on the web purporting to show English-speaking foreigners in Ukraine's army uniform in the port city of Mariupol.
Стоп, подождите, скажите, что это?
My face, please.
Now, this man was caught on camera as a journalist trying to question him on the situation in the city shortly after it was shelled. And here's another video.
Maybe explode, maybe not, so blow up in situ.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, the description under that video claims that the person in uniform seen at the start of the clip is American. However, I should say there is no proof that that is definitely the case. The details of the patch on his shoulder, they are indistinguishable, and the man's facial features cannot be made out. Other videos have previously emerged, those showing foreigners among the ranks of the Ukrainian National Guard, which is made up of volunteer troops.
Around 400 mercenaries from the private US security firm Academy are involved in the operation against anti-government activists in Ukraine. That is according to a report in the German newspaper Bild am Sonntag, citing an intelligence source. Earlier, the German intelligence service told the government about the mercenaries' involvement in the operation. However, it's not clear who commands and pays the private military contractors. Academy, previously known as Blackwater, gained notoriety after alleged atrocities committed during the Iraq War. The firm had earlier been accused of involvement in the Ukrainian crisis. An unverified video that supposedly shows US private contractors operating in the city of Donetsk emerged in March. The security company has not commented on the latest revelations, but previously denied any involvement in the Ukrainian crisis. By foreign policy expert Daniel McAdams to speak more on the subject. Hello to you. What are your thoughts on these recent revelations? Why would the government in Kiev involve foreign mercenaries?
Well, I think you have a lot of Kiev-appointed oligarchs in the East who are very, very wealthy, and they have an interest in trying to quell this unrest. What's interesting about these last two stories we've seen about U.S. involvement is they've both come from major German newspapers, and it makes you wonder whether the Germans are not getting nervous that the U.S. is pushing this too far. We saw, for example, last week in Bild, a story that dozens of CIA officers were involved in helping put down the unrest in the East. And now we've seen this other story in a German paper. So I think under the surface, you're seeing a lot of very concerned German people and German businessmen for what's happening.
Some $300 million in military assistance from America following the approval of Congress. And while the money is still to appear, American soldiers are on the ground training Kiev's troops. But as Murad Gaziev, he reports, frustration is already mounting with Ukrainian army's capabilities.
By and large, the Ukrainian military is a conscript army.
And when you hand multi-million-dollar weapons to barely trained teenagers, you get trouble. Trouble multiplied by sorely lacking discipline. But not to worry, Washington sent almost 300 of its troops to train Ukraine's fledgling forces.
While en route to Ukraine, understood that they might not know even the basics.
And when the troops do know how to use something, it's not a fact that that something will work.
Abort.
Lacking in equipment and spare parts, Ukrainian soldiers have turned creative. Some of their vehicles, for example, would not look amiss on the set of a Mad Max movie. Some might even stand out. The other demon is alcohol. Blame a lack of discipline or stress. Fondness for drinking in the ranks has led to tragic consequences. In this video, locals curse a reportedly drunk Ukrainian soldier who ran over and killed a little girl.
The Ukrainian military is being called on to wage the most unpleasant kind of war, a war against its own people. And here you can debate about how much restraint it should have or should not have shown. But what you can't argue with really is that it's done a messy job so far.
Murad Gazdiev, RT, Eastern Ukraine.
As regards the supplies of weapons to the Assad government and as regards to who has the blood of the children and peaceful citizens of Syria, I believe you will not deny that the blood is on the hands of both of the parties. And there's always a question, who is to be blamed for that? Who is to blame? I believe you will not deny the fact that one hardly should back those who kills their enemies and eat their organs and all that is filmed and shot. Do you want to support these people? Do you want to supply arms to these people? So in this case, it has hardly any relation to the humanitarian and cultural values that Europe has been professing for centuries. In Russia we cannot fancy such things happening. But if we speak calmly in cold blood, in a business-like fashion, let me draw your attention to the fact that Russia supplies arms to the legitimate government of Syria in full compliance with the norms of international law. We are not breaching anything. Let me emphasize that we are not breaching any rules and norms, and we call on all our partners to act in same fashion.
The opposite argument is that the United States has defense treaties with the Philippines, with South Korea, with Japan. It doesn't have a defense treaty with the Ukraine. So arguably it ought to be being more robust in East Asia than with Ukraine. How would you respond to that perspective?
First of all, there was no question of a security treaty with Ukraine in recent years, and certainly not now. I think the situation is very different. I think in the case of Ukraine, we're dealing with an effort by an adjoining power to destabilize Ukraine internally for the purpose of subordinating it externally. That is the central objective. Now, how it's going to be sought, we do not know. I suspect that Putin's reaction to Ukraine was a product, in many respects, not of a strategic calculation, but of personal rage, after discovering that the West was outbidding the East in the courtship of Ukraine, not talked about, namely making a negotiating effort with Russia to deal with the sort of geopolitical problem that Ukraine poses for them and for us. I do think that we should be at the same time more open to help the Ukrainians defend themselves if they are attacked, because they'll only defend themselves if they're attacked, if they think we'll help them. So there is a kind of a duality here. I'm not in favor of rushing forces into Ukraine or engaging in immediate massive shipments of weapons. But I certainly do think that if we are to deter the Russians from moving in, we have to convince the Russians that will be costly and prolonged. It will only be costly and prolonged if the Ukrainians fight. The Ukrainians will only fight if they think they will eventually get some help from the West, particularly in the kind of weaponry that would be necessary to wage a successful defense. They're not going to beat the Russians out in the open field, where thousands of tanks move in. They'll only beat them one way. Prolonged urban resistance. Prolonged urban resistance. Then the war becomes costly. Then its economic costs escalate dramatically for the Russians. And then the war becomes futile politically. But to be able to defend a city, you have to have handheld anti-tank weaponry. You have to have handheld rockets. You have to have some organization to make it difficult. But city fighting is the most difficult and most costly kind of fighting for any partner engaged in a war, unless that partner is prepared to use weapons of total destruction, which obviously don't come into play here. International system in which countries are invaded by thugs and destabilized from abroad, and why this is a common responsibility, not just for us, but for our allies, and for other friends like the Chinese, who should not draw wrong conclusions from this, and whose stake in stability is at least as great as ours. I was at a dinner recently with a prominent German politician, and a representative of Siemens was there. And after I made some of my views known, which I hope they're considered to be reasonably moderate, even if tough-minded, and the Siemens representative clearly disagreed and said, no, this is terrible, and we have just been in Moscow, and you know, we have major interests in our relationship with Russia and so forth. And sitting next to me was Bob Zelig. And I didn't say anything to that response. And Zelig ripped into this guy and said to him, what you have said is very interesting. What percentage of your global sales involves your deal with Russia? He said, 2%. Then Zelig says, and what percentage of your dealings with us? He says 20%. And then there was silence in the room. And of course, everybody got the message. You better learn how to calculate what your interests are. It was well done. I was impressed. I didn't feel I had to intervene. I just rubbed my hands. This way, you have some of the cake, we have some of the cake, and we both can eat our portions. That right now, a significantly larger number of Americans are interested in the outcome of the basketball championships than of the Ukrainian issue.
To this country. You've done pretty well here. I don't get it. No, you wouldn't. You're one of the ardent believers, a good American. Oh, there are millions like you. People that plod along without asking questions. I hate to use the word stupid, but it seems to be the only one that applies. The great masses, the moron millions. Well, there are a few of us who are unwilling to just troop along. A few of us who are clever enough to see that there's much more to be done than just live small, complacent lives. A few of us in America who desire a more profitable type of government. When you think about it, Mr. Kane, the competence of totalitarian nations is much higher than ours. They get things done. Yeah, they get things done. They bomb cities, sink ships, torture and murder so you and your friends can eat off of gold plate. It's a great philosophy. I neither intend to be bombed nor sunk, Mr. Kane. That's why I'm leaving now. And if things don't go right for you, if we should win, then I'll come back. Perhaps I can get what I want then. Power. Yes. I want that as much as you want your comfort or your job or that girl. We all have different tastes, as you can see. Only I'm willing to back my tastes with the necessary force.
It covers your plan for the military overthrow of the United States government.
I presume, Mr. President, you're prepared to back up that charge?
I am prepared to brand you for what you are, General. a strutting egoist with a Napoleonic power complex, and an out-and-out traitor. I know you think I'm a weak sister, General, but when it comes to my oath of office, defending the Constitution of the United States...
Somebody has to teach me how to salute a flag.
Somebody has to teach you about the democratic processes that flag represents.
But don't you presume to take on that job, Mr. President, because frankly, you're not qualified. Your course of action in the past year has bordered on criminal negligence. This treaty with the Russians is a violation of any concept of security. You're not a weak sister, Mr. President. You're a criminally weak sister. And if you want to talk about your oath of office, I'm here to tell you face to face, President Lyman, that you violated that oath when you stripped this country of its muscles, when you deliberately played upon the fear and fatigue of the people and told them they could remove that fear by the stroke of a pen. And then when this nation rejected you, lost its faith in you, and began militantly to oppose you, you violated that oath by simply not resigning from office and turning this country over to someone who could represent the people of the United States.
And that would be General James Mattoon Scott, wouldn't it? I don't know whether to laugh at that kind of megalomania or simply cry.
James Mattoon Scott, as you put it, hasn't the slightest interest in his own glorification. But he does have an abiding concern about the survival of this country.
Then, by God, run for office! You have such a fervent, passionate, evangelical affection for your country. Why in the name of God don't you have any faith in the system of government you're so hell-bent to protect? You say I've duped the people, General. I built them. I've misled them. I've stripped them naked and made them defenseless. You accuse me of having lost their faith, deliberately and criminally shut my ears to the national voice.
I do.
Well, where the hell have you heard that voice, General? In freight elevators? In dark alleys? In secret places in the dead of night? How did that voice seep into a locked room full of conspirators? That's not where you hear the voice of the people, General, not in this republic. You want to defend the United States of America, then defend it with the tools it supplies you with, its Constitution. You ask for a mandate, General, from a ballot box. You don't steal it after midnight, when the country has its back turned.
93 World Trade Center bombing by saying they didn't kill enough people. It wasn't said by militants. It was said by FBI agents. They didn't say it because they wanted more blood, but they understood that it would take more blood in order to get the government to react. And now I'm hearing other FBI and other officials say to me, Steve, we're going to need another 9/11.
General Franks said some of the most profound words of this generation. He spoke of the worst thing that can happen to this country. First, quoting, a massive casualty-producing event somewhere in the Western world. It may be in the United States of America. Then the general continued, the Western world, the free world, loses what it cherishes most, and that is freedom and liberty we've seen for a couple of 100 years in this grand experiment that we call democracy. It was this super patriotic warrior's fear that we would lose that most cherished liberty because of another attack, one, again quoting General Franks, that causes our population to question our own Constitution and to begin to militarize our country in order to avoid a repeat of another mass casualty-producing event, which in fact then begins to potentially unravel the fabric of our Constitution. And here we are, the fabric of our Constitution being unraveled anyway. Habeas corpus neutered, the rights of self-defense now as malleable and impermanent as clay, a president stifling all critics by every means available, and when he runs out of those, by simply lying about what they said or felt. And all this even without the dreaded attack. General Franks, like all of us, loves this country and believes not just in its values, but in its continuity. He has been trained to look for threats to that continuity from without. He has perhaps been as naive as the rest of us in failing to keep close enough vigil on the threats to that continuity from within.
I want to emphasize that the U.S. has been selectively mute on various countries' construction activities on China's islands and reefs that they have occupied, but have made irresponsible remarks on construction that is lawful, fair and reasonable within China's scope of authority. The U.S. is either using double standards or has ulterior motives. I'd like to reiterate that China's construction activities, no matter the speed or scale, match the international responsibilities and obligations of a major power of the world. The Chinese people can make their own judgment, and no one has a right to tell China what to do.
Foreign military aircraft. This is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Please immediately.
High above the South China Sea, the radio crackles with a stern warning.
Go, go!
The
source of dispute appears on the horizon seemingly out of nowhere. Islands man-made by China, hundreds of miles from its coastline.
So when's the last time you went up?
CNN got exclusive access to classified U.S. surveillance flights over the islands.
80 knots. Check.
First time journalists have been allowed on an operational mission by the state-of-the-art P-8A Poseidon, America's most advanced surveillance and sub-hunting aircraft.
So we've just arrived on station now above the 3 islands that are the targets of today's mission. It's these 3 islands that have been the focus of China's building in the South China Sea over recent years.
China's alarming creation of entirely new territory in the South China Sea is one part of a broader military push that some fear is to challenge U.S. dominance in the region. Sailing its first aircraft carrier, equipping its nuclear missiles with multiple warheads, developing missiles to destroy U.S. aircraft carriers, and now building military bases far from its shore.
These pictures taken from the American P-8 sub-hunter show just how close the Chinese fighter jet came. Close enough for the American crew to easily see details on the Chinese craft and even the pilot inside.
It's difficult to say with precision, but within 30 feet of the P-8. Very, very close. Very dangerous.
And it didn't happen just once. As the American plane flew on what is being called a routine patrol mission, repeatedly the Chinese fighter roared over, under, and beside it.
The Chinese jet also passed the nose of the P-8 at 90 degrees with its belly toward the P-8 Poseidon. We believe to make a point of showing its weapons loadout.
Military officials say the incident occurred in international airspace about 135 miles east of Hainan Island, just off the south coast of China. And it is just the latest sign of friction as America and its allies clash with the Russians and Chinese over surveillance.